the velvet haze, and a frightened whisper. The air in the starlight room hung thick and sweet, a velvet haze of cigarette smoke and expensive perfume. Laughter, sharp as cut glass and mellow as aged whiskey, swelled and receded, like the tide against a distant shore. Red velvet banquettes lined the walls, gleaming under the soft glow of sconces, while the clinking of ice and the murmur of hushed conversations formed a symphony to the city's nocturnal pulse. Dean, perched casually on a stool at the bar, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his fingers, watched the scene unfold with an easy smile playing on his lips. His eyes, though, missed nothing. A skinny boy, no older than 16, navigated the crowded tables with a precarious tray laden with empty glasses. Leo Moretti, the new busboy, his dark hair perpetually falling into wide, frightened eyes, moved with the anxious urgency of a trapped bird. He clutched the tray like a shield, his knuckles white. He was good at his job, quiet and efficient, but tonight, his usual timidity was amplified to a palpable tremor. His fear wasn't unfounded. Bruno the Brawler Rizzo, a hulking figure with a face like a bruised plum and a cheap suit stretched taut over his broad shoulders, had taken up residence by the kitchen doors. Bruno wasn't a regular patron. He was a predator, a self-appointed tax collector for the shadows. He watched Leo like a hawk, a cruel smirk twisting his thick lips. As Leo passed, Bruno's meaty hand shot out, catching the boy's arm in a grip that made him wince. A few glasses wobbled precariously. Well, if it isn't Leo the Limp, Bruno sneered, his voice a gravelly rumble that cut through the club's din. Forgot something, didn't you, squirt? Leo's breath hitched. He tried to pull away, but Bruno's grip tightened. No, Mr. Rizzo, I brought the empties back. Empties aren't what I'm talking about, Bruno growled, leaning closer, his breath reeking of stale beer and cheap cigars. That protection money, kid. Your old man's late. Again. And I ain't got all night for his excuses. He gave Leo a rough shake, causing a half-empty glass to slide off the tray and shatter on the polished floor with a sharp crack. A few heads turned, but most quickly looked away, accustomed to Bruno's reign of intimidation. Rosie the Siren Mancini, behind the bar, her gaze sharp as a razor, clutched a bar rag in her hand, her knuckles white. She looked ready to leap over the counter, but years of experience kept her rooted, for now. Leo flinched, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Tears welled, but he fought them back. Please, Mr. Rizzo, my father... He said he'd have it by Friday. He promised. Bruno laughed, a harsh, humourless sound. Promises don't pay the bills, kid. Are you going to tell your old man to cough it up, or am I going to have to explain it to him myself? And trust me, you don't want me explaining things. He gave Leo another shove, sending the boy stumbling backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Dean Martin, who'd been observing the tableau with a detached air, slowly straightened on his stool. His half-smoked cigarette still hung from his lips, but the easy smile had vanished, replaced by a subtle hardening of his jaw. His eyes, usually dancing with amusement, now held a cold, unwavering focus. The velvet haze suddenly felt a little colder, and the laughter a little less bright. A disturbing echo. The clatter of trays and the low murmur of conversation usually filled the commissary, but a sudden, sharp crash cut through it all. Dean, nursing a lukewarm coffee, looked up. Across the crowded room, Leo stood frozen, his face a mask of mortification. At his feet, a spilled constellation of juice, milk, and mashed peas spread across the linoleum. Bruno, the Brawler Rizzo, stood over him, a sneer twisting his coarse features. "Look what you did, you clumsy oaf!" Bruno roared, though it was clear to anyone with eyes that he had deliberately hip-checked Leo, sending the tray flying. Leo, already a figure of quiet anxiety, trembled, clutching a clean, empty tray as if it were a shield. I'm sorry, Bruno," Leo stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He started to bend, an instinct to clean up the mess he hadn't made. Bruno's hand shot out, seizing Leo's arm just above the elbow. His grip was vice-like, twisting until Leo gasped, a sharp, pained cry escaping his lips. "Sorry, ain't gonna cut it, runt. You owe me a new lunch, and you're gonna get it for me, now!" Bruno's eyes, small and beady, darted around, daring anyone to intervene. Most looked away, their gazes finding sudden fascination in their plates, or the peeling paint on the far wall. Dean's usual easygoing demeanour hardened. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, a familiar chill that hadn't visited him in years. He saw not just Leo, but a string of forgotten faces, the scrawny kid whose lunch money was always borrowed, the girl with the thick glasses whose books were perpetually scattered. He remembered the burning shame, the helplessness, the quiet rage that simmered beneath the surface when nobody stood up. That feeling, long dormant, flared to life, sharper and more insistent than ever. His jaw tightened. The easy smile that usually played on his lips was gone, replaced by a stillness that was more unsettling than any outburst. He watched Bruno's thick fingers dig deeper into Leo's arm, watched Leo's face contort in genuine agony. It wasn't a show, it was pure, unadulterated cruelty. The air in the commissary seemed to thicken, the low hum of conversation fading into an oppressive silence. Everyone felt it, the palpable tension of a brewing storm. The walk to the storm. The clink of ice against glass, the murmur of conversation, the faint, sweet scent of gardenias from Rosie's corsage, all faded into a dull hum in Dean's ears. He'd been watching Bruno for a good 10 minutes, the hulking man's voice growing steadily louder, more aggressive, as he leaned over Leo, who was practically shrinking into the worn velvet of the booth. Leo's hands, usually a blur of motion as he polished the bar, were now clasped tight under the table, knuckles white. Bruno's snarl was a familiar sound, a predatory rumble that usually sent everyone scurrying. But not tonight. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched Dean's lips, a private amusement that didn't quite reach his eyes. He unfolded himself from the comfortable embrace of his armchair, a movement so fluid it seemed effortless. His cashmere jacket, a deep midnight blue, shifted with the motion, catching the low light. He set his half-empty glass of amber liquid down with a soft, deliberate thud that was surprisingly audible in the sudden hush. His gaze, steady and unwavering, locked onto Bruno. There was no aggression in it, no challenge, just an unnerving calm that seemed to absorb the volatile energy Bruno was radiating. Dean began to walk, each step unhurried, a languid stroll through the smoky haze of the club. The polished soles of his shoes made no sound on the checkered linoleum floor. A hush, thick and heavy, began to spread from table to table. Patrons, who moments before had been engrossed in their own worlds, now paused, drinks halfway to their lips, cards suspended mid-deal. Rosie, perched on a high stool by the bar, had stopped wiping a glass. Her usually sharp eyes, narrowed in concern, followed Dean's progress. A ripple of anticipation, subtle yet palpable, moved through the room, a collective holding of breath. They knew this walk. They'd seen it before or heard tales of it. It was the walk to the storm, and Dean Martin was the eye of the hurricane. Bruno, still haranguing Leo, hadn't noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. His broad back was to Dean, his fists clenched, vibrating with impotent rage. Dean simply continued his approach, a picture of nonchalant grace, the low hum of the jazz trio picking up, almost as if on cue, a mournful saxophone weaving through the silence. The first exchange, the clatter of dropped dishes from the kitchen, usually sent Leo scurrying, a familiar dance of deference when Bruno was in one of his moods. Today, however, the thud was followed by a sharp yelp, a sound that cut through the general hum of the evening crowd. Dean, polishing a tumbler behind the bar, paused, his gaze drifting towards the swinging kitchen door. He saw Bruno, a hulking shadow, leaning into the smaller man, Leo's face a mask of crumpled fear. The words were indistinct, but the sneer on Bruno's face was universally understood. Without breaking his rhythm of wiping the glass, Dean ambled from behind the polished mahogany, moving with an unhurried grace that belied the sudden tension in the air. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout across the room. Instead, he simply walked up behind Bruno, a casual, almost accidental approach. Then, with a practiced ease, he reached out and placed a hand, not firmly, but with a light, persuasive pressure on Bruno's broad shoulder. The movement was so fluid, so unthreatening, it almost seemed like an invitation to dance. Bruno, mid-tirade, stiffened. He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as they registered Dean's presence. Dean offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, his own eyes holding a calm, unwavering glint. "Bruno, my friend," Dean's voice was a low, smooth rumble, like gravel skipping over velvet. "Ease up a little, huh? Leo's a good kid. Let's take it easy." The words were spoken with an almost indolent charm, devoid of accusation, yet carrying an undeniable weight. For a moment, Bruno seemed taken aback. He was accustomed to deference, to fear, to quick retreats. Dean's nonchalance was an unfamiliar challenge. Then, as if to reassert his dominance, he scoffed, a harsh, guttural sound that scraped against the quiet hum of the room. He puffed out his chest, a bullish display of power, and with a sudden, violent jerk, he roughly pushed Dean's hand away. "You stay out of this, pretty boy," Bruno snarled, his voice thick with menace. "Or you'll find out what happens when you stick your nose where it don't belong." The air crackled thick and heavy with the unspoken threat. Leo, wide-eyed, seemed to shrink further into himself. The rest of the bar, sensing the shift, grew eerily quiet. Silence before the strike. The melody of ice, the hum of voices, the jukebox's smoky serenade, all abruptly vanished. A profound hush descended upon the blue note, as though a conductor had silenced a symphony mid-crescendo. Every head pivoted, every gaze converging on the drama unfolding by the bar. Bruno the Brawler, Rizzo, his reputation preceding him like a storm front, loomed inches from Dean Martin. Bruno's face was a mask of incandescent rage, his heavy jowls quivering with indignation. His outstretched hand, still slick from the drink he'd just hurled, trembled with volatile energy. Dean, by contrast, remained unnervingly still, a portrait of casual aplomb that only stoked Bruno's fury. Leo Moretti, the cowering catalyst of Bruno's wrath, whimpered faintly from behind Dean's protective frame. Rosie Mancini, perched as always at the bar's end, froze mid-polish, her usually mischievous eyes now narrowed to dangerous slits. "You think this is a game, pretty boy?" Bruno's voice, a gravelly threat, splintered the silence. "You think you can just saunter in here and boss me around?" Dean's characteristic smile, the one that typically charmed and disarmed, held its ground. Yet a subtle shift occurred. The corners of his lips, usually curved with genuine amusement, tightened imperceptibly, a hint of restrained power, and in his eyes a perilous gleam, like sunlight on a newly sharpened blade, flared into existence. It wasn't anger, not precisely, but a calm, unyielding resolve that belied his languid posture. The air crackled with expectation, a collective holding of breath as the club braced for the inevitable eruption. Rosie, ever the keen observer, noted the transformation. She'd witnessed Dean navigate countless skirmishes, but this felt different. The usual flippancy had evaporated, replaced by something cold and inflexible. This wasn't about saving face or a quick exit. This was about a primal, deeper conflict. Bruno, fueled by cheap whiskey and bruised pride, missed these subtle warnings. He saw only a man audacious enough to defy him. "I asked you a question, Martin," he roared, a fleck of spittle arcing from his lips. Dean's gaze remained locked on Bruno's. The glint in his eyes intensified, promising swift repercussions for any further aggression. The room seemed to shrink, the tension a palpable weight pressing down on everyone. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing just before the impact. Words as weapons. The oppressive drone of the fluorescent lights in the back room intensified the palpable tension. Bruno, a belligerent behemoth, had trapped poor Eddie, his colossal fist hovering perilously close to the smaller man's nose. Eddie, a tremor of pure panic coursing through him, resembled a field mouse caught in an eagle's predatory stare. Profound silence enveloped the handful of onlookers, a concoction of dread and macabre fascination. Dean, casually propped against the doorframe's chipped paint, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips, finally pushed off. He moved with an unhurried grace that defied the inherent danger. "Rough day at the office, Amore Bruno?" Dean's voice, a low rumble, smooth as aged bourbon, conveyed not a hint of apprehension. Bruno's head snapped up, his porcine eyes narrowing to slits. "Stay out of this, Martin! This ain't your fight!" His utterance was a guttural snarl, a jarring contrast to Dean's measured cadences. Dean took another leisurely drag, then exhaled a languid cloud of smoke. "Seems to me a fair fight involves two men of roughly equivalent stature, Bruno. Unless you've recently decided to take up bullying children and household pets." The words, delivered with detached amusement, landed like a sharp slap. A nervous ripple of suppressed mirth swept through the room, swiftly quelled by Bruno's incandescent glare. His already florid face deepened to an alarming shade of eggplant. "You trying to be witty, Dino?" he snarled, taking a menacing stride towards Dean, momentarily abandoning Eddie. Dean merely held his gaze, his eyes calm and unwavering. "Witty? No, Bruno, just making an observation. It requires a particular brand of bravery, doesn't it? To torment someone half your weight, twice your fear? Truly heroic stuff." He paused, allowing the unspoken accusation to saturate the air, thick and undeniable. "Makes me wonder what you're overcompensating for, big man, or exactly who you're truly afraid of." Bruno's jaw clenched so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He was accustomed to blind subservience, to terror, not this quiet dissection of his character. He was a bull, easily spurred, but Dean wasn't engaging him in a brawl. He was anatomizing him, exposing the flimsy veneer of his supposed toughness. The fury in Bruno's eyes escalated, yet it was tinged with something else, a fleeting glimpse of shame instantly buried beneath a fresh deluge of rage. He took another step, shoulders hunched, fists clenching and unclenching with rhythmic intensity. "You got a death wish, Dean?" Dean simply flicked the ash from his cigarette. "Not particularly, but I do possess an aversion to bullies, especially the sort that inflate their chests for an easy target, then crumble when someone actually takes a stand. You're all bluster, no bite, aren't you, Bruno? A big boisterous hound that bolts from the first genuine challenge." The colour drained from Bruno's face, replaced by a ghastly pallor. He wasn't just incensed now, he was utterly humiliated, and humiliation was a potent accelerant for his particular brand of rage. His hand twitched, a silent promise of impending violence. The air crackled, thick with the expectation of a brutal impact, the unforgettable move. Bruno's face, already a mottled crimson, contorted into a mask of pure rage. A guttural growl ripped from his throat, echoing the low rumble of a territorial beast. He launched himself forward, a wild, uncoordinated charge fueled by indignity and a lifetime of getting his own way. His meaty fists were clenched, ready to deliver the kind of blunt force that had earned him his menacing moniker. Dean, however, wasn't where Bruno expected him to be. In a blur of unexpected motion, Dean swayed. A dancer's grace in the face of brute aggression. He didn't back away. Instead, he shifted his weight, his right foot sliding back just an inch, his left shoulder dropping almost imperceptibly. Bruno, momentum his undoing, missed by a good foot, his flailing arm, whistling through empty air. The force of his own lunge, unchecked, sent him stumbling, his heavy boots scraping on the dusty pavement as he fought for balance. A flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by renewed fury, crossed Bruno's features. He regained his footing, turning to face Dean again. But before he could regroup, Dean made his move. It wasn't a punch or a kick or any of the expected retaliations. Dean extended his right hand, not with a strike, but with a precise, almost gentle push against Bruno's chest, just above the sternum. At the same instant, his left foot, quick as a viper, hooked around Bruno's left ankle. It was less an attack and more a redirection of energy, a judo throw without the theatrics. Bruno, already off balance from his earlier lunge and now caught completely unawares, found his feet swept from under him. He yelped, a sound more of shock than pain, as his considerable bulk hit the ground with a resounding thud that sent a small cloud of dust skyward. He landed flat on his back, winded and utterly humiliated, his arms splayed out like a beached whale. The stunned silence that followed was deafening. The onlookers, who had braced for a brutal brawl, now stared, mouths agape, at the improbable sight of Bruno the Brawler Rizzo, sprawled ignominiously in the dirt. Dean, meanwhile, stood perfectly still, his hands now casually tucked into his pockets, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. He looked as unruffled as if he'd just complimented a lady on her hat. Bruno lay there for a moment, gasping, his fury momentarily eclipsed by sheer bewilderment. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, spitting a mouthful of grit. His eyes, when they finally locked with Dean's, held not just anger, but a new, unsettling glint of fear. He'd never been handled like this, never been made to look so utterly foolish without a single punch being thrown. Dean had disarmed him not with force, but with an unexpected elegance that was far more devastating to Bruno's fragile ego. The fight was over, not with a knockout, but with a quiet, undeniable declaration of dominance. Dean hadn't just won, he had redefined the playing field. Aftermath and applause. Bruno. The brawler. Rizzo scrambled to his feet, Amore. His face a mottled canvas of disbelief and fury. The imprint of Dean's palm still bloomed red on his cheek. He mumbled a choked threat about what he'd do if he ever saw Dean outside this dump, but the words lacked their usual venom. They were weak, hollow pronouncements from a man whose bluster had just been thoroughly deflated. His eyes darted around the room, meeting not fear but a sea of triumphant, mocking stares. The fight had been short, brutal, and entirely unexpected. Bruno, so used to ruling with an iron fist and a sneer, found himself on the losing end of a verbal sparring match that somehow escalated to a physical one, all orchestrated by the man who usually just charmed his way through life. Bruno's bravado, his only real weapon, had been shattered by Dean's cool defiance. He was a lion whose roar had turned into a whimper. With a final desperate glare at Dean, Bruno turned tail, pushing through the murmuring crowd. The heavy oak door of the club swung shut behind him with a thud that seemed to echo his humiliation. He was gone, and everyone in the room knew instinctively that he wouldn't be back. Not to this club, not to bother anyone here ever again. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the room, quickly replaced by a wave of exhilaration. Leo, who had been cowering behind the bar, now stood upright, his usually pale face flushed with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. His eyes, wide and shining, fixed on Dean. He stammered, Mr. Martin, I don't know what to say, thank you. He always... His voice trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his awe. Dean merely offered a nonchalant shrug, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, as if adjusting his tie, rather than having just faced down the club's most notorious bully. Then the applause began, a single clap from a table in the back, then another and another, until the entire room erupted. Patrons stood on chairs, clinking glasses, their cheers a deafening chorus that celebrated not just Dean's courage, but the liberation of their own fear. Rosie the Siren Mancini, who had been watching the entire spectacle with a shrewd glint in her eyes, walked over to Dean, a wry smile gracing her lips. Well, Mr. Martin, she purred, her voice cutting through the din. Who knew you had it in you? A new kind of respect. Dean's hand clapped Leo's shoulder, a firm, unadorned gesture, silently pledging protection. A swift, almost imperceptible wink, a fleeting spark of the old Dean, preceded his unhurried return to the table. The club, still vibrating with the confrontation's aftershocks, seemed to part for him. He settled back, a wisp of smoke already coiling from a freshly lit cigarette, his gaze sweeping the room as if nothing had disturbed the evening's placid surface. But it had. This raw defiance against a notorious bully rippled outward, a tremor through the smoky haze. Whispers, at first furtive, gained momentum, each retelling, burnishing the nascent legend of Dean Martin. Not the swagger of a street brawler, but an understated, almost reluctant courage had seized everyone's attention. He hadn't sought a fight, he'd simply refused to let Leo, trembling and pale, suffer public humiliation. Rosie, the siren. Mancini, perched on her customary bar stool, had witnessed it all. Her sharp eyes, usually scanning for trouble, had locked onto Dean. She'd noted the subtle shift in his relaxed posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, the iron edge in his voice as he told Bruno to back off. Rosie knew Dean wasn't one to be trifled with, but this felt different. This was a man interceding not for himself, but for someone vulnerable, upholding a simple principle of decency. Later, as she deftly polished a glass, she overheard two of Bruno's lackeys. Never seen him like that, one grumbled. Just cold. Bruno didn't know what hit him. Leo, still reeling, but now buoyed by a fragile sense of relief, found his gaze drawn to Dean with newfound reverence. The image of Dean, composed and resolute against Bruno's sneering menace, had seared itself into his memory. Dean hadn't raised his voice or thrown a punch, yet he'd dismantled a brute with sheer presence and a few precisely chosen words. It was a power Leo had never encountered, a strength unbound by brute force. The perception of Dean Martin within the club, and indeed, throughout the city's clandestine circles, had irreversibly shifted. He was no longer merely the charming crooner, the smooth talker with a melodic voice and a quick wit. He was now seen as a man of quiet conviction, one who would champion what was right, even when the odds stacked against him. The incident had cemented his reputation not as a tough guy, but as something far more formidable, a man whose moral compass pointed true and who possessed the courage to follow it. A deeper, more profound respect beyond any applause now trailed him through the crowded room.